some biblical ideas about honor and shame, and it was spurred by this book, Ministering in Honor, Shame Cultures. And I'd like to do that one more day this week. What I did last time was talked about several verses in Scripture that talk about honor and shame, what I had taken from the appendix of that book. What I'd like to do today is use another appendix from the same book that goes through several stories in the Scripture that talk about honor and shame. And I'm just going to read basically what the book says here in the appendix. So I'm very much borrowing this from Ministering in Honor, Shame Cultures by the two authors you can see right there. I'm going to eventually, this book has a lot of other stuff in it. It has some really practical stuff about how to respond to people from another culture in a way that will be winsome and that will help draw them to Christ, and in a way that's fully biblical. So I really love that, but I'm not going to get into that. I am going to put this temporarily in the church library. I've spoken to PJ about it. And if you want to borrow it for a while, you're welcome to do that. Just eventually return it. And after people have had a chance to read it for a few months, I'll probably take it back for my own personal library. And maybe we'll buy one as a church. I'm not sure. But so feel free to go grab this from the library if you would like. In the meantime, though, I want to, again, just sort of walk through a lot of Scripture and talk about how it talks about honor and shame. I'm just going to read you what this says. I'm going to paraphrase it occasionally. The idea is that not only are honor and shame themes that show up in verse after verse after verse of Scripture, but they're also themes that show up in all sorts of narratives in Scripture. So going right through in order. It starts in creation. God places man at the pinnacle of creation. Remember Psalm 8:2, you've crowned him with glory and honor. So man starts with great honor, not because of what he does, but because of who he is as the creation of God in God's image. But then the first thing that happens after the fall is that Adam and Eve, they disobey him, they dishonor God, and then they feel shame and they're expelled from paradise. They're expelled from being in community with God. And so right away, it's a picture of the shame of sin and the honor we had with God before that shame led us to be cast out. The very next chapter, Cain kills Abel. Why? Because he feels dishonored when God doesn't accept his sacrifice, when God disregards him. And so his status envy, his envy of the honor that Abel's been given, leads him to kill his brother. A little bit later in Genesis 11, we see humanity building a tower to the heavens, trying to build a name for themselves and exalt themselves to a position of great honor above God. And then we see Abraham. God calls Abram, and what does he promise him? It says here, to a position of great, he calls him to a position of grand prominence, a great nation, an abundant family, divine blessing, mediation of universal blessing. I'm going to use you to bless all the nations on the earth. So it was a call to great honor as being God's chosen person and God's chosen people. Leah and Rachel. I don't know if you remember this. Leah is the one that Jacob doesn't love. And so God restores her honor by having her bear the first 4 sons. And then he removes Rachel's reproach when opening her womb. Joseph is abandoned by his brothers, cast out in dishonor by his brothers to die in a pit. And he becomes the person of the greatest honor, second most honor in all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. Moses becomes a fugitive shepherding in the desert. And then he confronts and overcomes Pharaoh, the symbol of the most status and the most honor there is. God exalts one and puts down another. He takes somebody who's in a shameful outcast position and brings them to a position of honor, or confronts the honor of the world in a way which brings it down. Job, his entire family rejects him and alienates him, but God at the end restores his fortunes and his social standing. And Israel in general is pictured as being a helpless orphan, and then God turns it into his precious and beautiful wife. That's the picture in the Scriptures in Isaiah, or actually this says Ezekiel 16 talks about this. Okay, Ruth and Naomi. The book has a whole chapter on Ruth, which is really interesting, which shows how the whole story of Ruth and Naomi makes so much sense in an honor-shame context. Ruth and Naomi were in a place of shame because of the death of their husbands, and they had come back to the community and weren't necessarily going to be accepted back into it fully because of where they were. But Ruth is given honor through Boaz becoming her kinsman redeemer. And it's a wonderful picture of Jesus because of the way he brings us back into, or even into a place of greater honor than ever before with God, making us adopted as God's children through what he's done. Hannah glorifies God for exalting her from barrenness through the birth of, for exalting her from barrenness through the birth of Samuel. Eli's sons. God humiliates Eli's worthless sons because of their disgraceful conduct as priests. They dishonor him. It brings dishonor on them. David, youngest, forgotten, not that honored, but he rises to a position of great prominence in Israel. Saul, he gets very envious because of the honor that David is getting, because of the praise he gets. Remember Nabal and Abigail. Nabal is this foolish man who dishonors and insults David, and Abigail alleviates the tension by honoring David and his warriors with a large feast. So this all makes sense in an honor-shame context that wouldn't have made as much sense without it. Saul's burial. The Philistines publicly desecrate the body of Saul, but the citizens of Jabesh-Gilead valiantly reclaim the body to avoid further dishonor. Michal, Saul's daughter and David's wife, despises David for, quote, shamelessly celebrating the ark's entrance into Jerusalem, but is disregarded as being less than the servants. Mephibosheth. The book also has a whole section of a chapter on Mephibosheth, who was the crippled grandson of the deposed Saul, in a place of great dishonor. But David honors him and brings him right to his very table, which is a place to say he is being granted honor by me. There's another place in 2 Samuel 10 where David sends servants as a gesture of honor to Hanan and the Ammonite king, and then he greatly shames them by cutting off their beards and garments and sending them back home in dishonor, and that's basically his declaration of war. When Nathan rebukes David for Bathsheba, he rebukes him for scorning and despising God, and he predicts the humiliating demise of David's reign. Tamar and Amnon. Tamar remains in desolation after her brother Amnon violates her and then refuses to marry, bringing her into great shame. Shimei brings dishonor and insults against David, but David refuses to retaliate against his verbal and physical insults when fleeing Jerusalem and instead trusts it to God. Uzziah, a king who enters God's temple despite the priest's warning, so God removes his honor by afflicting him with leprosy, which makes him an outcast. Daniel escapes imminent destruction and ends up being a prominent Babylon official. Over and over, these pictures of how God brings one up to a place of honor and brings another one down. Nebuchadnezzar, boastful king of Babylon, scornfully treated like an animal until he finally honors and glorifies God as the sovereign king who grants honor and splendor. Esther and Mordecai, they become prominent leaders in the Persian Empire from being despised and facing imminent death. Hosea and Gomer. Hosea, as an act of prophetic judgment, marries an unfaithful spouse to symbolize Israel's disgraceful unfaithfulness to God. Nehemiah returns to Persia to repair a dilapidated and disgraceful Jerusalem. When you see things through the eyes of honor shame, you realize that it's all the way through the scriptures. In the Gospels, Mary, a young virgin, greatly favored by God and given birth to and gives birth to the Son of God, Son of David. The leper. Jesus cleanses a leper who's with a mere touch, allowing the leper back to enter the temple and offer sacrifices and become a member of the community again. There's a widows and a dead son. Jesus erases the shame of widowhood and death by raising that widow's son in name. Remember the woman who he went. This book also talks about this. The woman who visited Jesus while he was in the house of the Pharisee, and she was wiping his feet with her tears and weeping and she was a sinful woman, it says, and the Pharisee there was a whole honor shame thing going on there. She was an outcast, she was sinful, she was dishonorable. They were thinking that he was becoming dishonorable because he was associating with her, and he turns it around and says, no, God is here to raise people back to honor through forgiveness and through removing their shame. And he actually says, you're the one who'd be ashamed. You did not treat me as you should have as a host. The Gerasene demoniac. Jesus cures a naked, demon-tormented man living in the tombs, thus greatly increasing Jesus' own fame. Jesus heals and purifies a woman subjected to 12 years of incurable bleeding, and he honors her with praise. Zacchaeus, he graces a short tax collector on the periphery with honor by entering his house. That makes a lot more sense when you see that the very fact of entering his house was giving him honor. In the parables, when the regular folk are too busy to eat, the master invites all the poor and the blind and the lame. The prodigal son, the son shames his father by taking his inheritance and leaving off. And he comes back, and surprisingly, his father covers the shame and brings him back to a place of honor. The older son also dishonors the father after that, and the father makes the second invitation to him as well. The wicked tenants, ungrateful tenants, are expelled from the vineyard, and a picture of Israel's ethnic presumption and Gentile inclusion. The whole picture of bringing Gentiles in is a place of taking those who were once not a people and making them now a people. Controversies with the leaders. Pharisees kept asking all these things to trick Jesus and try to bring him into dishonor, but he silences their challenges and gains even more honor from the crowds for his wisdom. Foot washing, when Jesus washes feet, the fact that the leader, Jesus, the teacher, the rabbi, so to speak, kneels down and washes their feet shocks them. They don't understand how to take it. And he says, this is because I'm flipping all that honor shame upside down, because it's about what God honors and who God honors. And Jesus himself takes on the shame of the cross, not just the pain of the cross, although that's really significant, but also the shame of the cross. And God, as a result, highly exalts him and gives him a name above every name. So all the way through Scripture, in ways that I hadn't thought of all the way till I read this book, there's this theme over and over that God is the first of all, the one who honors or brings shame, ultimately. The world system isn't necessarily one we need to worry about. But secondly, that sin brings shame on us and led to our being cast out from the family of God. But in the cross, in the gospel, Jesus takes our shame and removes it from us and grants us honor again. And that's just as much a part of the great salvation of Christ as what he's done in terms of our legal guilt before God. Both are true. And I love that picture. So this is a book I recommend if you're interested in reading it. But even if not, I've tried to give you the scriptural basis for it, and that you can take and think about whether or not you want to read the book. Just recognize the idea of honor and shame all the way through the scriptures.